The alarm that night did not begin as an emergency. It began as a simple 3-note chime, rising like a question at the end of a sentence. I had heard that pattern for 15 winters, usually when a probe slipped or a patient shifted. Monitors complain for ordinary reasons. They rarely ask for attention with intent. This chime felt intentional. I was charged for the overnight, a role I had carried through blizzards, blackout drills, and the first winter we ran short on isolation rooms. My map for the shift lived in muscle and memory. Who was waiting on bed placement, which pump was fickle, which physician thrived amid noise, and which needed a calmer alcove. Our resuscitation bay sat under bright panels that made winter feel like bright noon, and our observation pod curved like a horseshoe around the nursing station where I kept the run board. Just after 2 a.m, triage registered a male in his 30s, found in a parked car with the engine off and the window cracked. No trauma. No obvious intoxication. He could answer orientation checks and tracked staff with clear eyes. The initial oxygen saturation on the transport monitor read as perfect, and the waveform looked robust. The 3-note chime sounded once while he was rolled across the threshold, then stopped. Transport gave me the short version. No obvious distress, but the cold had seeped into his clothes and his hands trembled more than I expected for the room temperature. We transferred him to the bay bed and attached house equipment. I guided the pulse ox clip, verified the pleth waveform, set the capnography line, and asked a colleague to tuck a temperature probe into place. The room settled into that odd, respectful silence that descends when a case does not announce itself. Then the first contradiction arrived. The pulse oximeter displayed an oxygen saturation that ticked up above what physiology allows. The number held for a breath or two, then drifted down into a believable range, then climbed again during a period when his chest moved less. At the same moments, the capnography trace flattened briefly, as if the patient had stopped exhaling carbon dioxide altogether. Yet his shoulders rose and fell under blankets in a steady cadence, and the bag of warm air I waved near the sensor changed nothing. The 3-note chime sounded again, from a pump that was not infusing. I charted the first artifact in the electronic record. Oxygen saturation briefly exceeding expected physiology. Pleth waveform present. Capnography intermittently flat. Patient alert, speaking in complete sentences. The timestamp placed at a few minutes after triage. I have learned that the only way to respect an anomaly is to anchor it with time and context and then try to break it. We moved through the first tier of rational checks. I swapped the pulse ox probe for a fresh one and tried the opposite hand. No change. I changed the capnography cannula and purged condensation. For a short stretch, the waveform returned, then slipped to a flat line while the patient's breath fogged the air. I verified chest rise with a hand at the sternum. I asked a colleague to count carotid beats while I watched the electrocardiogram. The telepack printed a narrow complex rhythm that matched the pulse, but a lighter secondary spike rode on the baseline every few beats, not tied to any mechanical event I could feel. The monitor did not alarm for that. It was the 3-note chime again, from the defibrillator across the aisle in standby. The stakes clarified as I worked. If I called a false deterioration, the patient would face invasive tests he did not need. If I ignored a true deterioration because the numbers misbehaved, I could shepherd him into harm. The unit's trust in our equipment hung in the space between. I requested a co-oximetry panel and venous blood gas, logged the time, and asked transport to hold the stretcher for a possible return trip to imaging. While the lab labels printed, I laid out a test plan in my note, the way I had learned to quiet my mind during complex nights. Sensor error and misplacement would be resolved by replacement and rotation. Electromagnetic interference would be probed by moving the bed and disabling nearby devices in sequence. A patient-borne device would be checked with a careful inventory at the skin and in his pockets, and with a focused question about implants. Carbon monoxide exposure or a hemoglobin variant would be approached through co-oximetry, comparing fractional saturations against the pulse ox. Crosstalk on telemetry would be tested by moving his pack to a different channel and watching adjacent beds for sympathetic spikes. Before I could begin the location tests, the corridor camera outside the bay blinked and its time overlay skipped forward by what looked like the length of a breath. Security later gave me their summary, but in the moment all I saw was the display hiccup and correct. The 3-note chime sounded from the central station, then faded. My colleague at the desk raised an eyebrow, and I felt that small, unwelcome alignment between eyes that says two people have noticed the same thing and wish they had not. I moved the bed. The resuscitation bay tracks allow a smooth slide. I shifted the patient one station down, away from the defibrillator and closer to the door. For a minute, the capnography trace steadied and drew a textbook waveform. The oxygen saturation settled into a believable range. Then the monitor announced a loss of signal on the capnography for a breath or two, even as the waveform did not fully disappear. The 3-note chime now came from a pump in the new bay, a device I had silenced and put in standby earlier in the night. The first lab printout arrived. The venous sample registered an oxygen saturation that was realistic. The co-oximetry did not suggest carbon monoxide poisoning, and the methemoglobin fraction sat within a normal range. If the pulse ox was inventing numbers, it was doing so without the usual chemical culprits. I documented the values in words and added a line. Pulse ox values discordant with co-oximetry, chest movement and mental status stable. I looked for a stimulator or a magnet. The patient had no surgical scars suggesting an implanted device. His pockets contained nothing that would broadcast or pulse. He denied any implanted hardware during his respiratory assessment earlier, and there were no bonds of adhesive on the skin that would suggest a recently removed patch. I noted that too. The telemetry pack was replaced, its channel changed. The secondary spike persisted on the baseline, subtle and annoying, like a metronome 2 rooms over. Patterns form in ways that feel like superstition until they are written down. Each time the stretcher rolled past the triage alcove, the 3-note chime surfaced from a new device. Each time the bed paused beneath the strip of recessed lights near the bay door, the capnography line flirted with flat. Each time I moved the bed closer to the nurse's station, the pulse oximetry number behaved for a handful of breaths, then wandered again. I listed these correlations in the note with times approximated in words, careful to separate observation from interpretation. Institutional stakes arrived in the shape of a decision about imaging. A chest X-ray would be routine for shortness of breath, but the lungs sounded clear and the breathing looked effortless. The lab did not suggest a gas transfer problem. A CT would have been extravagance without indication, yet I could feel the quiet pressure of the unseen. If there was a hidden risk and I chose parsimony, the retrospective judgment would land hard. I requested a portable X-ray as a compromise and placed a hold on a CT slot. I also opened an incident ticket to biomedical engineering with a brief summary. Recurring 3-note alarm across devices. Capnography intermittently flat with preserved chest rise. Telemetry baseline spike. Possible environmental contributor. Request survey at earliest availability. Just before 4 a.m, the portable X-ray machine rolled into the bay. The technologist parked under the same strip of recessed lights where the capnography misbehaved. As they positioned the cassette, the central station hissed with a short burst of alarms, like an orchestra tuning up out of key. The three-note chime rose above them, then stopped as the X-ray fired. When the image populated, the lungs looked clean, the cardiac silhouette unremarkable. I wrote that down, too. I ended the hour with a plan for escalation. I would move the bed to the step-down observation pod to test distance from the resuscitation cluster. I would run a second venous gas if the pulse ox continued to misbehave. I would ask security for a quick pull of the corridor camera time overlay to corroborate what I had seen. I would walk the aisles and listen for the three-note chime when no one was touching a device to test whether proximity to this patient truly mattered. The patient rested on the gurney with warm blankets and a steady breath, unaware that the unit itself had become my second patient. The question at the end of Act 1 was not whether his body was failing. It was whether the room that held him could be trusted to tell the truth about a body at all. We moved him to step down just after the portable X-ray, a slow roll along the corridor that I've walked through more winters than I care to count. I kept the transport monitor on battery, no wall power, to strip away one more place for interference to hide. The three-note chime rose as we passed the triage alcove, not from the device I pushed, but from the nurse's station behind us. It was the same clean, rising triplet, as if the unit cleared its throat. I marked the time in my note as a little before dawn and added a line I did not enjoy writing. Alarm tone heard without a clear source during patient transport. In step-down, I chose a corner bed with the fewest devices nearby. I silenced the infusion pump, unplugged the blanket warmer at the wall, and set the transport monitor on the shelf without connecting it to power. The patient's chest rose in a steady way. The pulse ox waveform looked strong. I watched a full minute, then another. The oxygen number behaved, then drifted past what should be possible, held there for a breath or two, and returned to believable. At the same moments, the capnography line fell to a short flat, even though the cannula sat right, and I could feel warm breath at the nostrils. The three-note chime sounded again, this time from the defibrillator 2 beds away in standby. I recorded the sequence in plain words and felt the first edge of frustration I had tried to keep out of the room. Falsification has a rhythm. You remove variables until nothing remains but the thing you are testing, and then you try to break that too. I swapped the transport monitor for a different unit that Biomed had cleared last month. I changed the telemetry pack and moved the channel again. I placed the pulse ox clip on an ear. I rotated the capnography line to the other nostril and seated it with care. I asked a colleague to take a manual blood pressure and feel the carotid while I watched the telestrip. The narrow rhythm tracked each pulse, but the pale secondary blip still rode the baseline like a weak echo, never aligning with touch. I wrote down each change and each non-change, and reminded myself that careful boredom is the most honest friend during a night like this. At the central station, I opened archived incident tickets from past winters and began a private ledger of similar threads. 2 years earlier, an overnight nurse on the opposite side of the unit documented a short run of unexplained capnography flats that stopped when a patient left for imaging. A month after that, a floating nurse on day shift noted alarm storms during a maintenance drill, with a note about overhead lights flickering. The tickets were closed with phrases about intermittent fault and no replication. I made a list of common elements in my note: transport, lights, and the same rising chime reported from different devices. None of it proved anything. It gave me a map of where to look. Security sent a quick summary of the corridor camera overlay from earlier. Their note described a brief time skip that self-corrected while our stretcher passed under the lens. I copied that into the chart and asked them to hold the clip. I did not know whether it mattered yet. It felt like a loose wire that might connect later. Biomedical engineering sent a night tech who walked the room with a handheld meter that sniffs at stray fields and bad grounds. He found nothing that shouted. He ran a self-test on the defibrillator and the pumps. All normal. He lifted the ceiling tiles near the recessed lights and frowned at dust, then reseated everything with care. I logged his visit with the list of checks performed and the result we both disliked, no fault found. I looked beyond the room. If this was a patient-born artifact, I should find a signal on the person that traveled with him across spaces. I asked for a second venous gas and co-oximetry, drawn while the pulse ox reading looked too high. The lab sent back results that sat in the range you would expect for someone breathing room air with lungs that work. I added a line that had now repeated, pulse ox values discordant with co-oximetry, while clinical status remained stable. Another angle. If the air itself was part of the trouble, a different pocket of the building could show relief. I requested a short walk to the ambulance bay with the transport monitor still on battery. It was a strange test in winter, but the simplest trials often are. We wrapped the patient well and rolled through the double doors into air that bit at exposed skin. The pleth waveform stayed strong. The oxygen number sat in a believable band. The capnography line drew a tidy square-topped trace. For a handful of minutes the world obeyed. Then, in that cold quiet, the three-note chime sounded from inside, muffled by doors and distance. The capnography line inside our monitor flattened for 2 breaths, while our patient's chest rose as steady as before. I wrote that sequence twice, once in the transport note and once in my own pocket notebook, as if 2 inks could hold it better than one. Institutional pressure surfaced in small ways that add up. Bed control wanted a plan for disposition. The attending asked for a summary for sign-out that would read clean to the day team. A resident stopped by and reviewed the chart, then left with an expression that nurses learned to read as professional doubt. The doubt did not offend me. It was the correct expression for a case that did not line up. The quiet pressure rode with it. Choose a lane. Call it artifact and discharge, or call it risk and escalate. I held the middle and kept collecting. I turned to the tools in our hands. I printed the transport monitor's trend strips and circled the moments when the oxygen reading rose too high. I wrote beside those circles the notes about chest rise, mental status, and capnography flats. I pulled the Telepax log and looked for error codes. None appeared. I checked the pump's event list and found brief self-checks at times that overlapped with our anomalies. I could not tell whether the pump woke because of an internal schedule or because something external nudged it. I wrote that uncertainty down, too. To test lighting as a factor, I asked the unit clerk to lower the recessed lights over the step-down corner while we watched the traces. With the lights dim, the capnography line behaved for a long stretch. When the lights returned to full, a short, flat segment appeared. This smelled like a lead, but it could have been coincidence. I documented it and moved to a bolder test. I unplugged every idle device within a few steps of the bed and verified silence. I stood between the bed and the nurse's station and listened. The 3-note chime cut through from the other side of the unit, rose, and stopped. It had the tone of a confirmation and no object attached to it. Midway through the night, sterile processing across the hall began a cycle. The autoclave has a vent sound that I have learned to tune out. That night it landed on my ear like the first half of our chime. As the cycle ramped, the capnography fell to a flat stretch that ran longer than before, then recovered. We were not touching the patient. The pleth waveform stayed present. The oxygen reading wandered upward for a handful of seconds and returned. I added the observation to the log and drew a thin line between the autoclave cycle and the flat segments. It was not proof. It was a thread. The pivotal event came when imaging called our held slot. The CT suite is shielded in a way that should make stray interference behave. It is a tidy space with its own rhythm and devices that do not share our unit's mood. I agreed to the scan as a stress test of the pattern. We rolled the patient down with the transport monitor on battery and the telepack still transmitting. In the suite, under the smooth hum of the gantry, the oxygen number climbed above normal again in the exact same way. The capnography flattened for a short run even as the chest lifted in a steady count. The 3-note chime sounded from our transport monitor itself, a device I had set to silent except for red alarms. The tone was impossible under the settings on screen, yet it was the same triplet I had been hearing all night. The technologist raised a hand and waited. I checked the patient, who looked comfortable. The scan completed. The images later showed nothing dramatic. I wrote a single line that felt heavier than it looked. Shielded environment did not break the pattern. On the way back, we passed the triage alcove. The corridor camera above us clicked as if it were refocusing, and the tiny clock in its corner lagged for a heartbeat before catching up. At the same moment, the telestrip caught a longer run of the pale secondary blip, not tied to any pulse I could feel. I knew how this sounded even in my own notes. I also knew that the cleanest test had just failed to falsify the thing I wished were only a story. By dawn, I had a board full of patients and a head full of this one case. The day team would want clear lanes and tidy plans. I had a ledger instead, written in careful words because words were all I could trust. The 3-note chime had become more than a sound. It was the boundary line between what our instruments claimed and what hands and eyes knew. Each time it rose, a device somewhere had awakened to a story that did not match the body in front of us. I stood at the central station and opened the digital audit trail for the transport monitor. A line near the end showed a self-test event at a time when we had not pressed anything. Another line showed a firmware alert about time sync recovery. The wording was bland and cautious, the kind you see when a device corrects a hiccup on its own. I compared those lines with my note about the corridor camera skip and the CT suite chime. The times were close by my best estimates, close enough to make my neck warm. I added a paragraph to the incident ticket that tied these pieces together without claiming more than they could carry. The ethical tension crested when the attending asked, through the normal channels, whether I would be comfortable sending the patient home with return precautions. He had eaten a snack, he had held a steady conversation, he had walked without trouble to the restroom. The monitors had told a stranger's tale. I looked at the policy about continuous monitoring for unexplained events. It did not imagine a night like this. It assumed that instruments, once checked and replaced and checked again, would either stabilize or fail clearly. We had something in between. I wrote my recommendation in plain words. Keep him until late morning, repeat labs once more, and sit him in a chair near the window and step down with the telepack on and the transport monitor nearby, still on battery, with lights at half. Ask Biomed to return with a different meter. Ask security to shadow the corridor camera time overlay during that period. If the pattern continued in daylight and under watch, report upward. If it faded in daylight, question why. As I finished that note, the 3-note chime sounded one more time. Not from a device, but from somewhere between devices, the way a room sometimes seems to answer its own question. The capnography dipped to a thin line and then recovered. The oxygen number kissed the ceiling and returned. The telestrip drew the pale echo again. I felt, more than thought, that the next step would ask me to choose between the comfort of numbers and the discomfort of what I had seen and felt with my hands. The protocol in my head, built over 15 winters, was about to crack. Daylight made the unit look honest. The windows took the edge off the ceiling panels, and the step-down corner felt less like a stage. I placed him in a chair near the glass, telemetry on, transport monitor on battery within reach, lights at half, blankets tucked. Security watched the corridor camera overlay from their desk. Biomedical returned with a different meter and a small logger that could sit on a shelf and listen for stray noise. I kept my run board simple so I could give this corner the attention it needed without failing the rest of the unit. I wrote a fresh baseline in the chart. Resting in the chair, steady breath, skin warm, mental status unchanged. Pulse ox waveform strong, oxygen number believable. Capnography drawing a square top. Telemetry narrow and regular, with the familiar pale echo on the baseline every so often. I described the room. 2 pumps silent on their poles, blanket warmer unplugged at the wall, defibrillator in standby with its screen dark. The 3-note chime had been quiet since dawn. I wanted it to stay quiet, and I also wanted it to speak again in a way that made sense. Mid-morning in our building always has a pulse. Food service carts pass. Transport moves in small waves. Maintenance checks something somewhere. On many weeks, the generators do a light test. I had never felt that rhythm touch a single bed before. As the sun pushed across the floor, the logger's tiny light blinked as it learned the room. The biomedical tech stood a little apart from everything and took slow notes, the way I do when I want to move air without moving anything else. The first shift did not come from the patient. It came from the corridor. Security called a short update through the normal channel. The camera time overlay hiccuped by a breath and then corrected. In the same window of moments, the transport monitor's audit trail captured a line about correcting its clock. I saw it after I refreshed the device log. The wording was bland and routine, like many maintenance messages, but the time matched the camera note. The patient's capnography stayed steady. The oxygen number held. The 3-note chime did not sound. I wrote that down exactly as it occurred. External clocks twitched. Our small corner did not answer. The day began to feel ordinary again. Bed control sent a polite nudge about discharge plans. I drafted a cautious plan for later, pending one more set of labs and a clean stretch of traces. Then, the day gave us the cleanest sequence it had to offer. A maintenance banner appeared on the unit portal, the small screen near the central station that posts routine notices. It mentioned a building power check. I looked at the lights in our corner. Nothing on the ceiling changed that I could see. The logger's light pulsed a hair faster, according to the biomedical tech's note. He marked a time. I stood where I could see the patient, the monitor, and, beyond, the corridor camera through the doorway. The 3-note chime rose from the central station, that same rising triplet that had followed us through the night. At the same time, the capnography on our transport monitor drew a flat segment that ran longer than any we had seen, while the patient's chest kept lifting and falling in an even count. The oxygen number climbed past where it ought to be possible, paused as if deciding, and then stepped back down into the reel. The telemetry strip printed a run where the pale echo on the baseline arrived with a steady cadence, not tied to a pulse I could feel at the wrist. The corridor camera's small clock lost a beat and recovered. The transport monitor, still on battery, added another line about fixing its time. The defibrillator screen flickered on and reported a self-check without being asked. The biomedical logger stored a spike that would later show as a short-lived change in the room's noise, nothing large enough to set off alarms, big enough to measure with care. I recorded each piece the way an old-school detective would, in sequence, in clear words, with no claims I could not carry. Patient unchanged, breathing steady, skin warm, awake and calm. numbers on a screen telling a story that diverged from the body and from hands that had done this for many winters. Chime heard at the central station, same 3 notes as overnight. Corridor camera overlay slipped and corrected. Device logs captured clock corrections. The logger marked a small event. If there had been a silver bullet, it would have been this. A shielded room made it stop. A power cycle killed it. A single plug stayed quiet. We had none of that. We had a small universe of clocks that, for a handful of breaths, went out of step and then found each other again. The patient sat in the center unchanged, and the machines around him disagreed and then agreed without his body changing at all. A reasonable next step was to shut the monitor off and watch. I powered the transport unit down and left the telemetry pack running. I kept my hand gently at the radial pulse and watched the rise at the chest. Security watched the corridor clock. The biomedical tech watched his logger. We stood as still as we could and waited. The unit portal cleared its banner. The lighting stayed fixed. A few minutes later, we heard the 3-note chime once, a low-volume version that felt like it came from the bones of the place rather than a single device. The telemetry baseline drew the pale echo again without any change under my fingers. The corridor clock did not move this time. The logger saved an ordinary line. I wrote the results as a clean negative for the power-down test. No capnography to flatten because the monitor was off, but the echo persisted on the telly strip and the chime still occurred, now without a device at our elbow to blame. By early afternoon, the patient had tolerated a meal, ambulated in the hall, and held a steady conversation with nursing and case management. No signs of hidden distress. Lab repeats sat in a steady range. Co-oximetry matched what it should. Even the pale echo on the telestrip grew more sporadic. Bed control pushed again. The attending weighed the same fork I had carried since the night. Do we risk a preventable harm by holding a man for the sake of a pattern, or do we risk missing a real thing by letting him go while our tools tell odd tales? I documented my recommendation, which I had shaped by the morning's clear episode. Keep him a few more hours under routine watch, then discharge with careful instructions and a follow-up, and keep the incident ticket open to investigate the environment rather than the person. He went home before evening with a calm pulse and a clear plan. The unit stayed behind with the mess. The immediate aftermath was not dramatic. It was a meeting that Monday with biomedical, facilities, informatics, and nursing leaders where I laid out the ledger I had kept. We looked at the device clocks, we looked at the corridor camera overlay, we looked at logs that used words like time recovery and self-test and heartbeat of the network. We looked at maintenance schedules for generator checks and autoclave cycles and the variable speed rooftop fans that the building rides like a breath. None of these explained everything. A few of them explained small parts. The only bold change that came from that meeting was a 2-source rule we wrote down and taught. When a screen tells a story that your hands and eyes do not believe, confirm with a second tool from a different family before you act. It was a plain rule that honored the quiet doubt that had kept a man safe for a long night. Facilities checked grounds and replaced a ballast in the recessed lights near the resuscitation bay door. Biomedical updated firmware on the transport monitors and tightened the time source that they listened to. Security moved the corridor camera overlay to a clock that did not share the same network as the monitors. Informatics made the central server stagger its time announcements so that the unit would not feel them arrive as a single wave. None of this turned our night into a solved puzzle. It made it harder for the same set of things to happen in the same way again. I changed too. I stopped treating the 3-note chime as a background song. When I heard it in a way that did not match what a body was doing, I wrote it down and asked where else it had sounded. I added a small sentence to my sign-out sheets about odd behavior, not to anchor bias, but to keep us honest when the room taught a lesson we did not want to learn twice. I began to carry a simple manual pulse oximeter in my pocket as a second source. It was not that I believed in ghosts. It was that I had watched clocks quarrel while a human being sat between them, and I did not want to be the person who chose a clock over a pulse. If the thing that moved through the unit that night had been real, in the way people use that word for bodies, our tools would have agreed on its shape. If it had been only artifact, then the small alignment of camera, monitor, pump, and defibrillator would have been a coincidence stacked on coincidence, and the capnography flatlines would have been nothing more than a computer pausing to count itself. In both versions, the risk lived in the same place, mistaking data for a person or a person for data. A careful nurse keeps those two apart. The last note in my private ledger came a few weeks later. The unit was quiet at shift change, devices cleaned and lined up, pumps off, defibrillators in standby, transport monitors on their shelves with batteries topped. I stood at the central station to hand over to the day charge and took one slow look around the bays. From somewhere that I could not place, the three-note chime rose and fell once, the same rising question I had learned to hear with attention. No one moved, no device flashed. Later, the server log showed a clock adjustment that happened once the building's time source corrected a drift. The sound had not come from a single machine. It had come from the system itself answering a small call and then going still. That night in January had started with a patient and ended with an audit of the way a room knows time. I still carry the feeling in my chest when a monitor sings those three notes in a way that does not match the person in front of me. I still write it down. I still trust my hands over a screen that forgets what second it is. The case did not prove a mystery beyond physics. It proved how thin the seam is between measurement and belief, and how easily a seam can split when clocks fall out of step. The question that remains sits on my sign-out cards and in the incident ticket that never closed with a single cause. When the shared clock that binds our tools slips by the length of a breath, what do we owe the person whose life we are measuring in that missing beat?